Sebastian. How are you?
Good, Eva. Time to record another ETS episode. The last one with Mette has proven incredibly popular. And we thought that it would be good to also follow up with one where we can, share our views with each other and maybe fill any gaps that we didn't fill with Mette.
Yeah, I think definitely much needed because we have episodes that are 30 minutes of length. So there's only so much we can we can add into the interview with Mette, and we need to have some space to reflect and share, and I don't know, possibly vent. Let's see.
Where should we go? I obviously have my list, you have yours. Do you want to take us away?
I mean, why don't we start with a big question that I understand we will disagree on, which is when I look at your posts on LinkedIn, is like, we have now a CDR compliance market, a huge one. And I'm like, I don't think it is a compliance market at all. It's basically a purchasing program funded by a compliance market that has implications to its cap. So what's your take now that you had time to see different reflections on this?
I understand where you're coming from, right? And I think that also lends itself to discussion around whether there should be even a minor direct integration, right? Or at least the ability for ETS obligated companies to buy removals as well. That's currently not the case, right? It's all indirect through this purchasing facility, almost all. But for me, it's still, this overall statement is true, because if it weren't for the ETS, this market wouldn't exist, right? And the ETS is a compliance market. So I think I'm curious to hear your rationale on why you think we cannot call this essentially a compliance market that has emerged in Europe or will emerge.
Well, I just laid it out. Basically, I see it as a funding tool. The only difference compared to innovation fund or modernization fund is the fact that we actually have an implication on the cap. So there's a amount of allowances sitting on top of the cap to be sold for this purpose, and that makes it different. But other than that, in my view, it's not direct versus indirect. You can have direct or indirect, but still not necessarily. It's like two different things. It's not necessarily direct versus indirect to me.
What about the option for Annex 1 installations in the ETS to generate
that
their
is
own
the
removals?
only part where I see kind of clear link. The problem there that it's capped, right? You can only bring your liability down to zero, but you cannot bring it to negative. You cannot earn more allowances through it. So I think it's unlikely to be used in the near future anyway, because the allowance price is just not on par with how much removals cost, especially the BioCCS, that is the first one. And interestingly, did you notice that for this purpose, it's only BioCCS covered and not DACs? Although, I mean, it's not really surprising because DACs is even less likely to be used for this purpose.
Yeah, but it's really interesting what we touched on, and also your post. I think you really made this clear in your post after the podcast with Mette, how now essentially there are these three opportunities or revenue streams opening up for facilities in Europe, at least BioCCS facilities, right? And that is huge compared to where we are today, which is really one, right? So I think this is a major, whatever we end up calling it, that's a major change for BioCCS facilities in Europe.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously an answer to so many requests made for so long, right? To make ETS open to this. But yeah, it's, I mean, I am relieved to see that finally we have this proposal in front of us. There's clarity on where it's coming from. I think it's going to get refined further through the co-decision process. Potentially some unclear elements will be further cleared up. What
do you think should be cleared up? Like, what are some of the elements that you think should be clearer?
I think one element that I find, and I also brought up in the interview with Mette, is this different treatment compared to how international credits have been incorporated. And I'm not talking about above the cap versus under the cap, but the contingency clause, because for international credits, if we don't buy them, then the linear reduction factor will be adjusted. But now, if there are allowances that have been auctioned, but the removals are not successfully delivered, and let's be fair, there will always be some uncertainty there, then there is nothing to tackle a gap like that. And I think we should have something in place also for this. There is a contingency in case allowances have not been auctioned, but if they have been, then we don't have. It's looks like a small nuance, but if we want to have like an overall complete picture, I think it would be helpful to have it clarified.
Wherever possible, I read some really interesting takes over the last week, and I'll bring in some of those opinions. One came from Lev Gantley from Philip Lee, and on this topic, he pointed out something that I hadn't thought about, which is if in 2033 we decide that we're not going to pursue international credits, then the linear reduction factor will essentially be higher, right? And we will end up probably with a higher carbon price than in the scenario where we have international credits. So there's an inverse relationship where if we use international credits, the price gap to CDR is likely to be higher than if we don't use international credits.
Yeah. And
that was an interesting observation, I thought, that there's almost they're almost pitted against each other in this proposal in a way that I don't know if it was intended or not. But again, shout out to Lev. I hadn't thought of that. Just to build on what you just said.
I've also heard it come up, not from him, but from elsewhere. And probably wasn't thought out this way, exactly. But it's just an obvious consequence of how this proposal is designed.
Yeah. Another thing that I've seen kind of, obviously, you opened with that on the podcast, is a 250 megaton ambition, promise, or target.
I was so surprised. Right? I was so surprised. I don't know if people noticed through my reaction who watched the YouTube. I did not expect this response from Mette.
But the proposal is not as clear as Mette was.
No.
And I do think that that we need that to be clarified, that these 250 megatons is not an ambition, that it's a target. Right. That's hopefully, something for the negotiations to work on.
And it's helpful that she clarified it, because that was like the big question, I think, that I heard so different views on, and very passionate, claims why this or that view is correct. And then we were able to get the clarification from the source. It is definitely helpful that the Commission has they're giving this very clear signal, right? It's very important for the removals market and so on. It's just, if I look at the proposal itself, how it's put together, the way I read it was that the clear commitment was to auction 250 million allowances and use those proceeds to buy removals, or the equivalent amount of removals. But I didn't read it as if the Commission is promising to buy 250 million tons of removals. But it's great that the Commission is making that promise. Let's see if that's going to be, in a way, better reflected in the proposal itself. Or it might have been also like different people will have different interpretations if they read things. You also were looking at it, I think, in different ways on different days at some point.
My first read was, this is a target. Then somebody pointed out to me that it might not be. Then I kind of took it back. I was like, this is not a target, it's an ambition. And now we're back to maybe target. So yeah, I've done a couple of 180s on this.
Usually we use the word aspiration, not ambition necessarily, if it's not a target, or like aspirational target or something. But yeah, so we did clear it up. I'm super happy for it.
I tried to get it out of Mette a little bit, the whole timing. I have a lot of concerns around timing, because the whole idea is you auction, you sell. And in the proposal, it says the auction target is, I think, in 2039, 48 megatons. We just assume that to hit the 250 megaton removals target, the same amount of removals would be bought and delivered in the same year, but that's not going to happen. Right. So just if I think about timing, I don't see how the equivalence will be achieved year on year and in that decade. It doesn't make sense to me. Do you know what I mean?
But I mean, if you think about if they go for offtakes, I mean, one of the elements that I wanted to bring up is the fact that in the proposal itself, the Commission actually mentions prioritizing payments post-delivery, right? I'm very relieved that Mette indicated that is not like the main or the only way they're looking at things, which also obviously the impact assessment hints at that it wouldn't make sense. But if it's offtakes, the actual money doesn't need to be there in the beginning. It's okay to wait for the allowance price to go up and then sell and then use those proceeds for the actual funding for offtakes.
But it would require...
Pre-purchasing is different, obviously, because then you need the money right away.
But there's two things there that I think, and in September they already want to bring out some ideas around how to structure these offtakes, right? But there are two things there that I'm not 100% clear on. One is, in the impact assessment, it talks about potentially 25% upfront payment for those offtakes. Assuming that some of those offtakes will be non-deliveries, what happens with that money, right? And what happens with that gap from that money? That's one thing. And the second thing is, if you do those offtakes, you assume a future carbon price. What if the carbon price ends up being different? Again, that creates a second liability. And I mean, these are now very detailed questions, but I really hope that there will be clarity on these potential liabilities and others in the September guidance.
Who takes the risk?
Sorry?
Who takes the risk?
Who takes the risk? And what do we do with that? There's already a gap that we're going to talk about in a second. What do we do if the gap becomes even bigger because of these issues? Who's going to foot the bill?
In the impact assessment, we do see it mentioned that it should be the Commission who takes on this liability if the funding is not enough and finding the ways to bridge the gap and so on. But I mean, these are huge amounts potentially. So, and
what do you think? Because I've also seen some industry positions already, and obviously very appreciative that there's this big budget, but all already saying, I don't know, 100 million extra allowances should be set aside to bridge the price gap, things like that. What do you think is really, like, how can the gap be bridged? Imagine 2034 comes around and we realize CDR is more expensive than allowances. What options does the Commission even have?
Well, we outlined some, right, during our first conversation with Mette, using carbon contracts for difference or something like this. The problem is that they didn't bring these activities, like most of it didn't kind of bring it in a typical sense under the ETS. They're not ETS activities the way some others are, which is a design choice, right? Or in a way, like BioCCS is an ETS activity, but like capped to a certain amount. I mean, what I was somewhat surprised about was how optimistic Mette sounded about bridging that gap, just based on what the impact assessment was indicating, that there will be eventually price parity between BioCCS and the UAs. And of course, like no one expecting that to happen for direct air capture. So a big question mark there anyway.
But can we dive deeper there, Elve? Because I mean, I really didn't want to push Mette too much on the podcast, but the cost modeling for me is a real pain point in this, at least in the impact assessment. And again, with your also carbon management Europe hat on, like, you are much deeper in CCS than I am, right? But what I've done, at least in the time that I had available in the last week, I've tried to dig deep into some of the assumptions behind this, right? And we can talk about DAC, BECCS, and Biochar. I actually think all of them are interesting to discuss. But for BECCS, I mean, just to give you one idea, it builds on two main inputs. One is the Ramble 2025 study that was done for the EU Commission. And that, by the way, only goes until 2035. And that assumed subsidized costs, for example, from CDR FYI for BECCS and BioCCS. And the second one was the NEGAM expert elicitation for the European Scientific Advisory Board. And there, to give you an idea, the assumptions for transport and storage were 38 euros per ton for BECCS and 18 for DACs.
Oh,
like
optimistic.
Other market reports I've seen on this put it multiples higher, just to give one example, right? And I was in a room with basically the biggest BioCCS BECCS developers in Europe in the last week, and I asked them about their take on this, and there was silence, right? Like, I mean, when you see these numbers,
was it on mic? And that's why they were silent, or they just didn't want to share numbers?
Because I mean, there's two issues. One, that a lot of them are competing on reverse auctions with each other, so there's very little transparency. And there's very little public. I've asked them, is there any publicly? Everyone says these numbers are off by a factor of 2. But when I ask them, can you point me to a number where I can show this publicly, what you're just telling me? They're like, this doesn't exist. We have this issue with our national governments as well, because they look at these numbers. We know the numbers are wrong, but we can't point them to other numbers besides our own. So when you see these numbers, as somebody who works a lot in this field, what are your reactions?
Well, as I already indicated also in a previous episode, optimistic. I don't have, final specific stats with me, but I would say at least a factor of 2. I would expect more. This is how much they seem to be off for now. Making projections is always difficult. How will things look like in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years? But
how much cost savings can we do on a large-scale BioCCS project that is already operating at 500,000 tons a year? Right? Like this is in the impact assessment there, or in the NEGEM study that.
There is also a big difference among BioCCS projects, right? There's a huge difference whether you talk about ethanol production or you're capturing pure stream of CO2 versus you get something way messier, like, you're capturing it from a waste incinerator. So that's just not the same thing. The capture price will be hugely different there. And then again, transport price really depends on how far and how you're transporting it. And then storage price, yet another element that can look quite different. But BioCCS is not one thing, also in Europe, and we should bear that in mind.
Yeah, I understand all of that. And I think actually in the impact assessment as well, they've actually, or in these studies, they've often equated BECCS and BioCCS in many ways, which especially when you look at cost structure, probably shouldn't because of some of the examples you just gave. I want to go much deeper into this, and I'll publish more on these assumptions in the next weeks, because for me, this is really something that I don't think these numbers are realistic. And if they're off by 10, 20%, it's one thing. If they're off by 50, 100 or 150%, it changes the picture completely.
But that's very fair that the numbers are optimistic. But then also, let's get real about, you do have another motivation on why you're bringing this up, because you want to bring up biochar in this context, because you've already shared plenty on that online in your blog post for Carbon Future, right? Like it's one of the important elements that you see as a potential solution. But it's not part of the proposal. I would say,
we can talk about biochar, obviously, but I would say for me, there's 2 elements to this discussion. Complete honest, the primary element is, I think if these numbers are completely off, we're going to run into trouble. That's the primary element. Then we can talk about how can you create a balanced portfolio with a lower cost, fine. But the primary concern I have is what these numbers mean for carbon removals in this whole proposal. That's the primary concern.
And we did hear Commission's response to the concern that we raised, right?
Yeah. But again, with Mette, and rightly so, I mean, Mette oversaw this whole proposal, so I don't expect her to know the assumptions of the BioCCS costs in this impact assessment. So this is a discussion probably to be had with the people behind that specific component. But yeah, she seemed optimistic on where this is going, right? But yeah, it's something that I think needs to be looked at. The same for DACs, by the way. On DACs, it relies on the same studies, by the way. And there's a huge assumption on essentially power prices in Europe in the 2030s.
And
which
that's
are hard to predict, but right now it's not looking great, right? And for biochar, I want to finish off this cost element because I'm really passionate about it. There's the inverse thing where they actually ended up with really low costs, right? But again, here it took a Ramble data study that had global biochar prices that have nothing to do with industrial prices in Europe. And so that's how you end up with 37 euros per ton or 60 euros per ton or something. So all to say, I think this all needs a little bit of love.
And I think you've said clearly that in Europe, you assume that the biochar price would actually go up and not down in that.
The good thing is in Europe, for Biochar, we have actually, I don't know how many people have seen it, but there's a yearly report by Biochar Europe where essentially all the biochar operators provide confidentially the information to Biochar Europe. And Biochar Europe creates a report on the back of it. And we've got a pretty good estimate for where the industry is at and how much it costs. And with biochar, and like DACs, for example, it's very simple. If you don't get paid enough, you just sell the biochar to a non-CDR use case, right? So there's a cutoff point below which it makes no sense to do removal. And we know that cutoff point, and that changes obviously based on policy. But it's way above the numbers that are here. Anyway.
So what else do you want to cover? I have maybe one more element on my side.
Got a lot.
Yeah,
as
okay.
Always.
Let's try to go through as much as possible. 8 minutes left.
Okay, we spoke about that. I mean, while we already built on kind of the cost thing, for me, one thing that was really interesting was how biochar was treated in the impact assessment versus the proposal. In the sense that in the impact assessment, it kind of goes through biochar. It explains kind of its main concern around monitoring and liability, around evidence base, and around cost. But it also is very favorable. It basically says, yeah, but we can manage this. Yeah, there are ways to work around this. And it almost, if you read just the impact assessment, you would expect there to be something in the proposal. And then you look at the proposal and it's not mentioned once. Right, nature-based solutions and carbon farming is mentioned. Biochar is not even mentioned. And so that was just a pretty interesting contrast to me.
But we did know that this proposal will not include biochar from the get-go.
We knew, and actually found the impact assessment much more favorable than I expected, because I expected something that was more strong in its language. It isn't. But I did find it interesting that it didn't even appear in the proposal itself, whereas nature-based solutions, for example, were explicitly mentioned.
In the proposal, I remember reading quite clearly the reasoning why BioCCS and DACs have included exactly the monitoring and liability and the CCS directive. So the argumentation was there. It just explained why what is included is included. It didn't go on explaining why something else is not included because it wasn't in the proposal to begin with.
Yeah, I agree. For me, it was just interesting that that reasoning was explained. Then it was also explained that there could be an open door towards nature-based. And actually, I found that really interesting that they said nature-based solutions with permanence trust potentially, which is something we covered in this pod, right?
Yes.
But there was just an omission of biochar in the proposal. Again, I thought the impact assessment was really interesting. Let's see where this develops. We already saw Peter Liese essentially make this point, the rapporteur for the EPP in the parliament, right? On this proposal. But yeah, let's see where this goes.
Let's see.
One thing that Robert Höglund pointed out, which I also thought was interesting, was how this is potentially one of the first times that in a major proposal or major policy proposal, removals are treated as equivalent functionally to an emission reduction, in the sense that an emission reduction can be, or that this is the whole framing of this proposal around carbon removals, is that a permanent removal should be equivalent to a real emission reduction. Whereas he said that basically in the SBTI and other frameworks, that is not the case, and that is proving to be quite complicated for the scale-up of carbon removal. So again, something that I wanted to highlight, because it could actually have trickle-down effects on other proposals that we're going to see.
I can see where this comment is coming from, but I'm just thinking how we're designing climate targets, which basically are about balancing emissions and removals eventually, and that is what gives us that net target. It's basically baked in, and now we're just operationalizing it from this one perspective that these fossil emissions can be balanced by permanent removals.
I guess where he's coming from, and I share that sentiment, is that we're going to reach a point, according to the proposal in the late 2030s, where a removal might become more cost efficient than a reduction.
Yeah.
Right? Good. And policy is often not designed around this cost efficiency, but around a strict separation, even if it's not cost efficient.
Yeah.
So I thought,
and he has been the one who has been bringing attention to this, I think, from the earlier days already, which is great, because yes, it is bound to happen at some point. We will see when exactly, but and we should design policies with that in mind.
Yes, but yeah, just one small thing. And on international credits, or in general, I mean, how do we create the supply that we need, right? We asked this to Mette as well. And for carbon removal, she was like, the demand signal should be sufficient, essentially. And the same can be said for international credits, but when I speak to developers in the global south, they're wondering if it's going to be enough. Like, will there be any other support to create the supply? Or do we just assume that the promise of procurement will be sufficient to create supply? And this is something that, again, is a big assumption, this proposal, I think, for both removals and international credits.
Yeah.
And I hear suppliers being skeptical on this.
There's a lot of parallels in there and the uncertainties, right? Because essentially, in both cases, we are buying certain types of carbon credits. And yeah, there are inherent risks in there when it comes to non-delivery. And I mean, as we talked about also during the episode with Mette, the pipeline of projects to begin with, right? That would be available.
Exactly. What was your final point, Eve?
What I wanted to get to was, if we don't get full clarity on how this price parity will actually happen between the auctioning revenues that we get and the removals that need to be bought, right? It's a great signal, but it sounds to me that unless we get better clarity how this will actually work in practice and how these serious volumes of removals are going to get bought, then for the time being, it still seems to be the voluntary markets where you can get decent price points at. I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy because it's difficult to find buyers. But voluntary market still plays an important role because this will take some time to play out.
And if I can bring another data point in from Tang Chen, he was basically saying, what if there's an undersupply of carbon removals? And I would say not just undersupply, but what if suppliers start triaging these different opportunities that we discussed, right? That could actually, they might charge higher than we assume. Even if the cost might be lower, they might charge higher because they've got optionality, especially in an undersupplied market in the 2030s. So there's this big, I think this unknown factor, what's going to happen in an undersupplied market where they can just keep selling into the VCM, for example. Why would they sell to the CDR ETS facility for 50 euros less than they can get on the voluntary carbon market?
Yeah, that's where I'm curious to see. I think Mette indicated that they intend to be competitive and, be a good buyer. We'll need to see what it means in practice, because the promised volumes are huge and can have such a big impact. But then it actually needs to work in terms of the price point it provides.
Yeah, but I mean, super interesting. Overall, we went into a lot of details, but I think we all agree, right? The signal is very strong, and it's better than I would have expected 2 or 3 years ago, if you'd asked me. So now let's see how this develops. And I'm sure we're going to cover it many more times.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be some interesting ideas floating around, interesting changes to the proposal we can chew through in the Scoop episode. So I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you, Eve.
Thanks. Until next time.